Radio.
Welcome to another episode of Working the Web to Win. I'm your host, Carl Weiss. With me in the studio is my co-host, Hector the Connector Cisneros, and today's special guest, Jay Galletly of Via eSigs. How you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Doing good.
Well, today, you ought to appreciate the title of the show. It's called The Smartest Guys in the Room.
And we're all here.
And we're all here, that's right. And one of the things we're going to be talking about, other than having Jay on here, we're also going to have a guest appearance by Bill Gates and also Steve Jobs from Apple Computer.
So we get the crystal ball out.
That's right. It's going to be a pretty interesting episode today. But before we get started, I just want to make sure that we tell all our viewers out there and listeners about the possibility of them calling in and joining the conversation. I'll let you do that, Hector.
So you notice they said viewers. We'll talk about that in a minute. For the guests to call in, it's 213-943-3808. It's 213-943-3808. Of course, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, and YouTube.
That's right. We've just started our own simulcast of our broadcast on YouTube. If you want to find the channel, all you have to do is go to workingthewebtowin.com, and under the social nets listing, you'll see our YouTube channel. Just click on it. It'll bring you over to the actual broadcast. And just like our radio show, once we're done with the broadcast, these are set up so that you can watch them anytime, and we'll even have numerous opportunities to go and see some of our previous broadcasts. Also on the YouTube channel, which is kind of interesting, is we've got some other things like vlogs and some items that we actually don't have on our radio show. So you might want to go check that out. Now, speaking of smartest guys in the room, one of the reasons we brought Jay on today is because Jay is he's actually the president of Via E, and electronic cigarettes are kind of a cool thing. Definitely took some smart guys in the room to develop that.
Yeah, I would say so.
Tell us a little about your product, Jay.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I love the theme, smartest guys in the room. I only wish that I was smart enough to be the guy that invented electronic cigarettes.
It wasn't you?
No, it wasn't. But I was smart enough to recognize that this technology represented an alternative to traditional tobacco that just showed tremendous promise and potential. You know, there's 43 million American smokers out there.
Yeah.
There hasn't been any technological changes to a traditional cigarette in over 400 years. So the fact that this technology is available and offers those people that enjoy smoking an opportunity to do it without actually lighting up a tobacco cigarette, but still satisfying their desire for nicotine, it's just incredible.
And best of all, of course, your brand is available online.
Yeah.
It is available online.
Go to viasigs.com. In fact, you can see that on our screen right now. And Jay and his company are also one of the sponsors of Working the Web to Win.
When I saw your product, I was really interested. But my father was around. He was an avid smoker, to say the least, and he used to smoke a couple of packs of Lucky Strikes a day. And I tried to get him to quit for years and years and years. And what really intrigues me about your product is it can come in 3 different strengths. Actually, 2 different strengths of nicotine and 1 without any nicotine. So this is a product that actually can help people get off regular cigarettes. And there are studies, I've read studies, that show that it actually works better than the gum or the patches and all the other stuff. Yet, the FDA is up in arms about, it's getting little kids or something.
Well, electronic cigarettes really haven't been through the clinicals which would allow them to sell them as smoking cessation devices. Having said that, people recognize that with varying levels of nicotine, you can start at a high level and work yourself down to ultimately, if you're fortunate, 0 milligrams of nicotine.
But also, it just makes common sense to me. I mean, if you're a smoker, you're used to having a cigarette in your hand. And taking that piece of the habit out of the equation is almost certain failure. I mean, that's the way I look at it. So,
Well, I'm a former smoker myself, and I went through that with the patches and all that stuff, and it's just not the same thing. You keep going back onto them time and time
you want
again.
to go grab a pencil or something.
Remember when Kojak used to have the lollipop?
Right.
That's right.
Well,
So it's definitely an alternative, and of course it also saves people a lot of money, and it also saves the stigma of running around smelling like a pack of cigarettes.
Exactly.
and know that if they go online to the site, they have some specials going on. So you tell us about those, because I think that was a pretty good deal. Again, if you're trying to, minimize the impact of tobacco in your body, this is a hugely great alternative
It
to
is.
doing that. So on the website, they have a special where they
Yeah.
get like,
And we'll make sure we put that on the web TV channel,
Okay.
so you'll be able to pick that up there. We'll have the link, so you can go over to get 50% off, so you can check it out.
Yeah.
So speaking of check it out, is talking about the Smartest Guys Room, of course, what we're talking about are the people that helped develop the internet. Because we wouldn't be sitting here right now doing this radio show if it weren't for the web. But a lot of people really don't understand where the web came from and a lot of the people that were behind it. In fact, it wasn't originally the internet, it was originally called the ARPANET. It was actually built by the Department of Defense because they were afraid that we were going to get wiped out by a nuclear bomb from the Soviet Union,
Right.
and they wanted to find some way to protect our communications. In fact, you used to work on the ARPANET.
when I worked for
back
the
then.
Army, as a civilian scientist, I worked on the ARPANET pretty much every day. So I would get on a teletype machine and I'd teletype Washington and say, send me this, send me that. You know, the ARPANET was one of the biggest players, but there were other things that sort of piggybacked, like there was FIDO and the UCCP and so on. And these other networks that universities were using, sort of, let's all get together.
Right.
And that's how the World Wide Web was founded.
Yeah, but the problem back then, though, was practically the only people that had computers were universities and the military, you know,
Right,
maybe
right.
some big corporations.
Right.
You know, most people didn't have.
And big corporations weren't sharing this stuff, maybe across, you know, countries where they had office here in, you know, Germany and one in the United States or something like that. But for the most part, they weren't using it very much. It wasn't until the invention of the personal computer that really sort of fired up the modus to move to having internet working in the first place. I remember in the 80s, I was working as a, you know, a computer tech, and we sold lots of computers, and the first thing we wanted to do after we got a computer was want to hook it to somebody else's computer. So networking, not internet
That's
work,
what
but
started it,
networking was
yeah.
born.
Yeah,
and
they had
then-
the wide area networks.
and then wide area
Those wide
networks, and then the
networks,
more of them were out there, the more you wanted to interconnect them, and that really led to everybody jumping onto the World Wide Web.
In fact, while we're at it, let's talk about some of the guys who helped develop some of the hardware that made it possible for us to do the things that we do. Of course, there were the two Steves, right?
Right.
Steve Jobs and Wozniak,
Wozniak,
right? In fact, it's kind of funny because when I was doing some of my research, I found this little clip, which I'll play now for everybody, which actually was a computer dating version. It's called The Dating Game. And this is back in 1983. Let's see some of this. And this is actually some of the guys that were the real big wheels back in 1983, some of which you probably don't even recognize. Mitch Kapor, who was Lotus 123. And that little kid over there on the end, it's Bill Gates.
Yeah.
And during 1984, Microsoft expects to get half of its revenues from Macintosh software.
Most people don't even realize because, of course, eventually, you know, Apple and more or less Microsoft kind of had a parting of the ways, mainly because of the IBM PC, which wasn't even around back then when this was originally
Right.
broadcast. But actually, when Apple got started, one of the people that helped them with the software was Microsoft, Bill Gates, yeah. Because he came out with BASIC. Because that was the problem when the original PCs came out, if you remember.
They really didn't have anything to make them work.
Exactly. When the original Apples, in fact, the first couple of Apples, I think I remember watching another broadcast with Steve and the Woz talking, and they were originally just building the boards. And then they
People
had...
would put them in wooden boxes. As a matter
Yeah.
of fact, on the blog, I actually have a picture of one of those original apples that were in the wooden boxes.
Right.
I bought an Apple II in 1979, and back then you had BASIC, but we used to still write in the machine code, because you could do more stuff in machine code, because BASIC was pretty limited, and there weren't really any storage devices. You had to have a cassette deck, an audio cassette deck that you would record stuff onto, and then you would play it back. It was really extremely cumbersome.
Oh, the stuff was really primitive back then. You know, and I think the first time that Steve realized he had something was when he decided, okay, we got to go out, we made these damn boards, now we got to go out and sell them. And I forget, he went to some, I don't remember what it was some retailer, and the guy said, I'll take 50 of them, but I want them to be completely ready to go. In other words, I want them put in the box, wired, power source, monitor, the whole 9 yards, and they're like, can we do that? It's like, okay, well, so they ended up making 100, and they broke even at 50, and that's basically how they got started. Yeah. And it wasn't long before, of course, they realized that, you know, the only way they were going to be able to make any real money with this was to make the box, you know, be able to do some things, and that's when they started to...
I know that you
bring
had
some
on
of
there,
the
you talk about
developers.
Lotus 123. The real first killer app was VisiCalc. I mean, there was about a 2.5-year period there that was the only magical tool that you can do anything with a computer.
Yeah.
The other one was WordPerfect, which
Mm-hmm.
came out about a year after VisiCalc, And again, now you had real word process. I remember selling about 100 computers to authors, because if they didn't have to retype a page,
sure.
it was a big deal to them.
Yeah. And that was one of the few things that computers did well back then.
Right. So,
But actually, that's what Mitch did. He actually took the idea behind VisiCalc and kind of put it on steroids, and that's how he came up with Lotus.
well, actually, what he did was he got sued by VisiCalc for stealing their ideas, and Lotus was so successful that what they were able to do is eventually buy VisiCalc and kill the lawsuit.
You know, of course, the same thing happened with what the heck's his name? WordPerfect. Because when the first version of Word came out, if you looked at the two of them, they were practically the same product, and I think eventually WordPerfect actually sued Microsoft.
And they didn't win because they didn't have enough money left over, because we lost so much market share. Microsoft was really good at cannibalizing a whole industry, and what
Yeah.
they would normally do is, if say a product was $500, they'd say, okay, you could get ours for $50
Right.
if you just show us the label from the other one. And they did it for about 5 or 6 years until their product got good enough where they could actually compete head to head.
Can you remember back then, Jim?
I think we're showing our age, because I remember everything you're talking about. I also remember it being a little cumbersome in the early days,
Yeah.
but it certainly is a phenomenal.
Well, especially before the graphical interface. I mean,
Right.
everything was a text interface, and some of them were the dot interface, where you dot and you type in a message, and then you'd get some obscure thing when you did it wrong.
Oh yeah, with MS-DOS, you had to know all the code. You had to know all the code calls to make it do anything.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of memorization involved. You know, it wasn't
Yeah.
point and click like it is today.
And it wasn't really till the first real Windows package, which came out actually in the late 80s. People think of, Windows 95 as the first transfer, but Windows came out about the same time, well, 2 years after the Mac, the first graphical interface PCs. And that's when people really started talking. Earlier, I remember I asked you about video toasters. Video toasters really were the first graphical computers that you could do all kinds of magical stuff with. And the Macintosh was a very inexpensive iteration, essentially, of a video toaster.
Well, there were several other things that were going on back then. Mostly, the competition started to heat up.
Right.
And, a lot of the computers that were in the game back then very quickly started falling by the wayside. And it got to the point where even some of the big dogs, like Apple, started to really sweat whether they were going to be able to make the cut. And if you remember, what was it, 94? When did Jobs start working on Lisa?
It was in the 80s.
80s. It was 84. 84, that's what it was.
It came out in 84, and the first run, man, they were dogs. I
Yeah.
was selling them, that's why I know.
Well, the problem was they were very expensive.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, the actual first runs, they actually manufactured them so some of the memory chips wouldn't stay in.
right.
So when they'd heat up, they'd pop out and the machine would fail. So that was the first real technical glitch. They fixed that
Right.
on the second manufacturing run, but by then the name was so
damage was
soiled.
done.
Yeah, the damage was
Yeah,
done.
so it almost backfired and did exactly the opposite of what they'd intended
And
to happen.
luckily, about, I want to say 13 months after they came out with the Lisa, they actually launched the Mac.
Of course, the failure of Lisa's was what ended up getting, Jobs more or less pushed out of his job.
Right.
And if you'll remember, he didn't stop there, because what did he do next?
He did
Just
next.
gave you the, right.
He made the next.
Well, actually, what he did was he ended up, he wasn't the only one that got the axe.
Right.
And there were a number of developers and programmers and systems engineers and everything else that ended up, on the street about the same time. So he kind of pulled them together and said, okay, let's take a look at what we've got here. And even though the Lisa was, quote unquote, an industry failure, they learned a lot from it.
Right.
And they decided to take some of the ideas that they had and come up with Next. Did you work with
I didn't work with any of the Next machines, but
Yeah.
I know that what was really neat about them, that led to a new way of using an operating system, because they used Unix, and they did things to Unix to make it better for them, and more graphical and all that other kind of stuff. And of course, the whole marriage with Pixar and all that kind of stuff led to that, because they were really trying to do some pretty cutting edge things. And that's what they used those PCs for. And they didn't really make a lot of them. They made like
50,000,
50,000
right.
or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
that sounds like a big number, but in the
No,
computer world, it's nothing.
That's nothing, yeah. But what it did was, first of all, it gave Steve Jobs a chance to, spread his wings a little bit, because while he was taking his little hiatus from Apple, if you remember, he also decided to noodle around with another little company, which you may have heard of, called Pixar.
Yeah.
And Pixar, of course, was the company that nobody really wanted. In fact, it was developed initially by George Lucas.
Right, Lucas.
And even Lucas couldn't afford to keep those guys going. And Steve just happened to have a lot of time and a lot of money on his hands, and he could manage to hold the line while they developed the technology that eventually ended up producing, such
Toy Story
blockbusters as
and
Toy Story, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, they brought him back in.
Yeah.
So once they, because actually what Apple did was it ended up reabsorbing Next. And a lot of the technology that Steve Jobs had developed, some of which ended up being used in their operating systems, and some of it still being used in their operating systems to this day.
Some of the layering techniques and
Yeah.
all the things that they're doing now
So-
came directly from that.
Sure. 'Cause one of the things that I like to point out is the fact that even the guys that are the smartest guys in the room, well, sometimes they're too smart for their own good.
Yeah.
Because, the question was with Next and with Lisa, I mean, was it just a case of just having the wrong vision, or was it just a case of being too far ahead of the curve?
Well, I think if you actually look at the history of technology in general, what happens is a company will be very innovative, they'll burst onto the scene, they'll grow like crazy,
Right.
and then they'll get too big for their britches. They'll think they can't do any wrong, and that's when they're ready for a pratfall.
And they usually take a hit.
And that's when they take a
And
hit.
sometimes they take a hit and they don't come back. We'll talk about some
That
of that.
happened to VisiCalc, that happened to Lotus, it happened to
Netscape.
WordPerfect, that happened to Database
Yeah.
too.
Netscape as well, which we'll be
Netscape
talking
is a
about
big one
shortly.
that,
But let me just show you one other thing. I'm going to cue some more video up here, because this was once Steve came back, of course.
Some people have thought that's a netbook. The problem is, netbooks aren't better at anything. They're slow, they have low quality displays, and they run clunky old PC software. So, they're not better than a laptop at anything, they're just cheaper. They're just cheap laptops. And we don't think that they're a third category device. But we think we've got something that is. And we'd like to show it to you today for the first time. And we call it the iPad.
So, the same guy that basically tried to revolutionize the computer industry back in 1984, a few years later, did come up with some very revolutionary technologies. The iPad, the iPhone, all those things were truly the next leap in technology, but sometimes, like you said, they stumble.
Yeah. Well, again, the things that they came up with were not new. They were just excellent iterations of those. For example, tablets had been around for more than 10 years. They weren't something absolutely new. A graphical interface smartphone, I had one in the 80s. It was called a Trio.
Right.
I mean, so those things were new, but their way of doing it was so innovative, so easy to use that any dummy could use that phone.
I got one here, I can attest to that.
So
Although I
now,
remember the first time I actually got an Android phone, and I looked at it and I'm like, crap, how do I make a phone call?
Yeah.
Had somebody show me. There's no keys on this thing,
Yeah, there's
When you're looking at this thing, it's just a black slab, and I'm like,
Yeah.
you didn't know the right button. You couldn't even get to the
you just have
screen.
to look for the one that looks like a phone. Yeah.
Well,
So,
you can't. When you first get it, there's nothing on there that looks like a phone.
yeah.
Somebody has to really teach you how to use it. But once you get used to it, you wouldn't go back to.
But on the
old way.
Apple, the phone was a very prominent item.
Right.
So it made it very easy to make a phone call. You click on the phone.
Yeah.
I mean, their intuitive interface was far superior. I mean, MP3 players, for example, had been around for 5 or 6 years. But it wasn't like the Apple's MP3 player because it had much more pictures and then, it was just a better iteration. Also, one of the best marketing companies on the planet, too. So let's not forget that part. I mean, it's not always all the sizzle and the innovation. Steve Jobs is a very dynamic guy. And when you listen to him, his voice and his mannerisms carry a lot of weight. I mean, Hitler had nothing on him. I mean, he could get up there and move
the crowd, yeah.
Right.
Well, I remember when the iPads were being introduced, one of their ads said, "Don't worry, you already know how to use it."
Yeah.
And that speaks to the intuitive nature of the technology.
So they worked.
Unless you're me.
Right. They worked really hard on making it very intuitive so that you didn't have to figure out how to use it. If you look at the iPad, for example, a lot of the things you would do is like paging through a book.
Right.
And all, those are very intuitive things you don't
Sure.
have to figure out. Plus, we're very finger-oriented. The only thing that's more oriented for humans than that is voice.
Yeah.
So if you could just tell them what to do, like in Star Trek, that's the only thing that could make it even more innovative. That is what Google is working
Yeah,
on.
we'll get to that, but I want to back up the tapes a little bit here, okay? Because we're kind of getting ahead of the curve. let's talk about some of the next innovation, which was, of course, the internet. Now, let's talk about some of the early evolutions of the internet, because it was the same thing. You know, all of a sudden, it went from literally nowhere to, you had dozens and dozens of search engines that were popping up like weeds. Remember Lycos?
Right. Before that, I mean, if you look at just the iteration of the browsers,
Yeah.
before they were regular browsers, graphical browsers, there was
Right.
Gopher and Archie and these other really arcane things which were like dot type of message in and hit enter. You know, and then Mosaic was the very first graphical
Right.
browser. Then Netscape, which was way better than Mosaic,
Yeah.
just took off. And again, they were in that position where they were very innovative. They had a really, really good product.
They were the killer app.
It was 5 years ahead
Yeah.
of everybody else, but they sat on their laurels.
Well, it was, they had help though.
Yeah.
Okay, because the problem was, as soon as Netscape jumped into the market and went public, like within 16 months of forming the company, it was unheard of.
Right.
And their stock was going crazy, you know, that's when Microsoft decided, Bill Gates decided they had to be in that market as well. And of course, Bill had one little advantage over just about anybody else.
You can give his away.
He could give it away because he was dominating the operating system market.
And personally, I don't think that that was a bad thing. I mean, him giving it away, people look at that as an unfair advantage, but it's his right to give stuff away if he wants to give it away.
Well, there were quite a few lawsuits that said that really wasn't necessarily his right at the time. But
Well, they said he had a monopoly because he had like
yeah.
80% of the market.
But as it turned out, even Bill couldn't monopolize on the web because you figured by now he got rid of Netscape, which was the big dog. He should rightfully have owned this market,
Right.
but he doesn't. Why?
Because there was another big guy out there named Google.
Yeah, but they weren't even big at the time.
No, that's right. In 1998, they were just getting started.
That's
I mean, they had just filed their first patent to get, the search engine, the PageRank patent, where their search was better than anybody else's search. And I remember Yahoo was really sort of one of the big players. Alta Vista was number one. There were probably a dozen search engines that were very powerful that could do what you wanted. But they had something that they invented that nobody else had, a system that could automatically go out, look at pages, and rank them on searching.
Yeah, well, the reason they did that was because originally, when Larry Page started to do his research, he was not actually looking to set up a search engine. He was looking to set up an electronic library.
Right.
So he quickly came up with a bot that would go out and start looking around for information, looking around for content, and that's what they ended up turning into PageRank.
Because originally, Yahoo didn't go out and search for your stuff.
Oh.
You had to submit.
Right, exactly.
And most of the search engines, that's the way.
That's
You would
right.
submit your information, then they would index you and list you and
Oh.
so on. But Google's innovation was, it went to you,
Right.
not you going to them.
That's right.
And that's really what people really sort of jumped on, and that's what really gave them the impetus to take off. So, I don't know, I always, in the beginning, I was a really diehard Yahoo person. I don't know about you, but when Google was out there and people said, I'm going to Google it, and I'm like, why don't you Yahoo it? And today, we use Google for pretty much everything, and Yahoo is still around. They're for like I don't know how many billion-dollar company,
Yeah.
but they're like minuscule compared to Google.
Oh yeah. Well, like I said, after Google went public, the whole game changed again.
Right.
And now today, not only does Google operate the world's most popular search engine, but they also have another most popular portal, which is of course YouTube,
YouTube, which
Right.
is the number 2 searched,
social network.
right? And it's also, I want to say, the number 2 visited site on the
Well, I
web.
mean, they
Second or
basically
third.
transmit 4 billion videos a day. I mean, that's an awful lot of traffic to have to top by anybody.
Yeah, and on top of that, I mean, they released Chrome, I think it was in 2004 or 2005 when they came out with Chrome, where they bought Chrome and essentially bought it in. And it took, let's see, Internet Explorer really took position 1 in about 2000.
Mm-hmm.
And it took 12 years or something like that for them to be dethroned, where last year Chrome became the number 1 browser in the world. So,
That's right. And Android, of course, is the number 1 operating system for smartphones.
And by de facto, it will soon become the number 1 operating system for computing devices, for the simple reason that
They're all
there
going
are hell-
mobile.
There are a hell of a lot more phones than there are computers. And everybody wants to be mobile. I mean, that's really the bottom line on that stuff.
Yeah. Well, the thing too is, we're talking about smart guys doing some really crazy things, and of course, Google is not beyond that. I mean, one of the things that they came up with, what was it, about a year ago, which they started talking about was, of course, Google Glass. You've heard of that, right?
Oh, yes.
But right now, they've only limited it to 1,500 people actually got a chance to buy these things, but it's very limited.
They're supposed to be
issue.
releasing the second iteration sometime in 2014.
Well,
We'll see, if they're still however ungodly amount of money they are a piece.
well, and we'll see again if this is something that turns into something greater, if it just turns into another, boondoggle, because of course those guys can afford to do it. But a lot of times what happens is when you announce something too early, you develop a lot of competition. We've already seen some other very similar technologies being offered by other companies already.
Right.
And of course, not to be outdone, right? You had Apple, which has been talking about the quote-unquote iWatch, which still hasn't hit the market, and they've literally spawned an entire industry off of this already.
I know Samsung has their own one out there, and actually
Pebble,
Apple
right?
is suing Samsung over their watch, which
Remember-
they don't even have a watch yet.
Right, and look at Pebble, right? They went out and
Pebble's out
crowdfunded a watch, which is doing very well right now, and there's a number of other, if you want to call them clones of that same technology that are out there. By the time Apple comes out with their iWatch, it might be all over.
Sony has one now. Fujitsu. I mean, there's a bunch of these Dick Tracy type watches out there already. One of the things that's neat about the internet, and it just so dawned on me, it's changed our lives so much. For example, I wanted to figure out, okay, what is the timeline of Apple's product release? All I had to do was type in Apple timeline, and it gave me about a dozen Apple timelines showing every which way Apple ever did anything. And any question you could just about imagine, you could just plug in, and you're pulling on literally billions and billions of pages of research that you
Right.
can find.
That's how we research our show.
I remember the commercial last year at Christmas time. The kid's getting a bicycle, and his dad's trying to put it together, and he can't find the instructions. And the kid's watching from the top of the stairs, so he runs to the room, looks up the site on the internet, prints out the instructions, and drops them from the top of the stairs, so that the guy can build the bicycle. That's the kind of world we live on now. The dark side of that is what happens if this technology goes dark on us?
Right.
Feel like a new TV show, Revolution or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, we're so intertwined with the web that it literally, if it went offline, everything would come to a halt.
One of the cartoons I saw that was really neat was it shows like 1980s, people starting to use their computers, and then the first part of the internet, and the guy says, "Oh, great, I have the internet, but my internet's down," and he's complaining. And then, like 2002, the internet's great, but it's too slow. And then the last one is the internet's down, and he's screaming and hollering because again, without this, people don't want to shoot themselves. I remember in the 80s and the early 90s when we were still using bulletin boards and stuff like that. The guys said, "I can't read my email."
Right.
Well, what did you used to do before you had email? Well, I don't know. We come quickly acclimated to having these tools to do all these magical things.
We can't do without
And if
it.
you take them away, it's like I'm going to go get my gun type of stuff, So it's just one of those things. We've got about 2 minutes left. So I think what we ought to do is thank our sponsors and make sure we get that out.
Okay.
So I want to say thank you to Tub King and to Senior Bathtub for sponsoring the show, of course, via E. And we want to make sure that we tell our guests to go out to the website and get the 50% off on there. And we want to tell them about next week's show.
Well, we're going to kind of get to next week's show because it's kind of a continuation from where we're picking up here because although, we talked about some of the innovators and some of the crazy things that some of these billionaires have spent their money on, Google really does, they don't have a monopoly on it, but they're trying.
Yeah, they're buying the Google car and the Google Street.
Well,
and the
there's
Google
more than
lights.
that. I mean, have you heard about the Google blimp? Have you heard about this?
I haven't heard about it.
Google is actually going to commission blimps to broadcast the internet to sub-Saharan Africa. So that's one
So the
way.
guys on the camels can.
That's right. The Bushmen and Kalahari will now be able to get YouTube like everybody else.
Yeah.
Of course, they're going to have to drop in the batteries and the computers for them to use out there too. And of course, I don't know if you've heard about the Google barges. You heard about the
Oh, yeah,
Google
I have
barges?
heard about
right.
that, yeah.
Which we really they claim is going to be some kind of high-tech showroom. I still don't know if I believe that or not because first of all, if you've looked at these things, they're not exactly friendly to the eye.
Yeah, they look like casino barges.
That's what I thought they did. Yeah, they look like casino barges themselves. So next week what we're going to do is we're going to go to the final, ultimate, boondoggle that Google has $50 billion in their pocket, just rolling around, burning a hole in their pocket. So what are they going to spend it on? Google's going to try to solve death. I did not make this up. This is actually
that's one of the things that they're
headline
working on.
Time magazine.
And they're very interested in extending life or whatever you want to call it.
Well, I guess if you're a young billionaire, you're figuring, hey, I can't take it with me. I got to figure out a way to stick around.
Right.
I want to make sure I thank all our listeners. Our blog numbers now are 22,000 plus reads, and of course the radio show Last week's show was 10,692 downloads, which is an all-time record for us. And we're at 83,000 downloads for the all-time record, so we should be busting about 100,000 before the year's out, so.
So I know they're going to be dying to come back for next week's show.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
between now, keep working the web to win.